The scorching Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the work camp just outside Silver Creek, where 7 orphaned boys stood chained to a wooden fence like animals waiting for slaughter. Their wrists were raw and bleeding from the iron shackles that had held them there since dawn, and their thin bodies swayed with exhaustion from hours of forced labor in the blazing heat. The youngest, barely 8 years old, whimpered softly as tears cut clean tracks through the dirt and grime covering his face, while the oldest, 16-year-old Samuel, tried desperately to shield the smaller children from the worst of the suns. Brutal assault. Camp foreman. Marcus Briggs walked the line of chained boys with the swagger of a man drunk on power, his leather whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent ready to strike. He was a massive brute of a man, with arms like tree trunks and a face that showed no trace of human compassion, only the cold calculation of someone who had learned to profit from the suffering of others. Behind him followed 2 guards, men almost, as large and twice as cruel, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of defiance or weakness that might provide an excuse for violence. "Look at them," Briggs said to his guards with obvious satisfaction, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that made even hardened men uncomfortable. 7 little rats who thought they could steal food from decent folks and get away with it. Well, they're learning different now, ain't they? Hard labor builds character, and by God, these boys are going to have plenty of character by the time I'm done with them. The boys had been sentenced to 6 months of hard labor for the crime of taking bread from a bakery when they were starving, their punishment administered by Judge Harrison, a man whose reputation for harsh sentences was matched only by his financial partnership with Briggs in several questionable business ventures. The work camp was officially designated as a correctional facility for wayward youth, but in reality, it was nothing more than a slave operation designed to provide free labor for local mining and construction projects. Samuel, quote, S. legs trembled as he fought to remain standing after 12 hours of breaking rocks under the desert sun. His back ached from the heavy sledgehammer he had been forced to swing all day, and his hands were blistered and bleeding despite the crude work gloves they had been given. But his physical pain paled in comparison to the agony of watching the younger boys suffer alongside him, children who should have been playing and learning instead of enduring conditions that would have broken grown men. "Please, sir," Samuel said, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "The little ones need water. Tommy hasn't had a drink since this morning, and he's starting to get sick from the heat." Briggs turned his attention to the 16-year-old, with the kind of predatory focus that suggested violence was never far from his thoughts. "Did I ask you to speak, boy?" he growled, his hand moving instinctively to the whip at his side. "Seems to me you haven't learned proper respect yet. Maybe a few lashes will help you remember your place." The threat sent a chill through all 7 boys despite the oppressive heat. They had witnessed Briggs's brutality firsthand during their weeks at the camp, had seen other children beaten unconscious for infractions as minor as dropping a tool or stumbling while carrying heavy loads. The foreman seemed to take genuine pleasure in inflicting pain, as if their suffering somehow validated his own twisted sense of superiority. "I'm sorry, sir," Samuel said quickly, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone trying to prevent catastrophe. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I was just worried about Tommy. He's only 8 years old, and he's been working as hard as any grown man all day." "Worried," Briggs laughed, the sound harsh and grating like metal scraping against stone. "You think I care about your worries? You're here to work, not to think. You're here to learn that actions have consequences, that decent society won't tolerate thieving little rats who think they can take what don't belong to them." 8-year-old Tommy swayed dangerously on his feet, his small face flushed bright red with heat exhaustion and his breathing coming in short, labored gasps that suggested his body was beginning to shut down from dehydration. The chains that held him to the fence were too heavy for his slight frame, and the iron cuffs around his wrists had cut deep grooves in his tender skin. "Please," 10-year-old Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Can't we just have a little water? We've been working since sunrise, and we haven't done anything wrong." The question seemed to enrage Briggs even further, his face turning purple with fury as he realized the boys were questioning his authority. "Haven't done anything wrong," he roared. "You're thieves and vagrants, every one of you. You're lucky Judge Harrison didn't send you to adult prison where you belong." Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the camp's reluctant medical officer, chose that moment to arrive for her weekly inspection of the facility. She was a woman in her 40s who had been forced to take the position after losing her private practice due to gambling debts, and her conscience had been bothering her more with each visit to the camp. What she saw, chained to the fence, made her stomach turn with revulsion. "Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "these children are showing clear signs of heat exhaustion and dehydration. They need immediate medical attention and relief from this sun. They need to learn discipline." Briggs replied dismissively. "A little discomfort never hurt nobody. Besides, they're getting 3 meals a day and a roof over their heads, which is more than they had on the streets." Dr. Warren knelt beside Tommy, her trained hands quickly assessing the boy's condition with growing alarm. His pulse was rapid and weak, his skin was hot and dry, and his eyes had the glassy look of someone whose body was beginning to shut down from heat stroke. If he didn't receive immediate medical attention, he could suffer permanent damage or even death. "This child needs to be moved to shade immediately," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. "All of these boys are in danger of serious heat-related illness. This is not discipline, Mr. Briggs, this is torture." "You're here to patch them up when they get hurt, Doc, not to tell me how to run my facility," Briggs said, his tone making it clear that he considered her opinion irrelevant. "These boys are convicted criminals, and they'll serve their full sentences no matter what you or anyone else thinks about it." The standoff between the doctor and the foreman was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider, coming down the dusty trail that led to the camp. Through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, they could make out a massive figure on horseback, someone whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere of the entire scene. "Who's that?" one of the guards asked nervously, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm as he studied the approaching stranger. Briggs squinted into the afternoon glare, trying to make out details of the rider who was approaching their isolated facility. What he saw made his blood run cold with a fear he hadn't experienced in years. The man on horseback was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, and built like the mountains themselves, with long grey hair and a beard that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. Even from a distance, there was something about him that suggested violence was never more than a heartbeat away. "That's Stone McKenna," Dr. Warren said quietly, recognition dawning in her voice. "I heard he was in the territory. He's got a reputation for protecting children from men like you, Briggs." The name sent a chill through everyone present who had heard the stories. Stone McKenna was a legend throughout the Western Territories, a mountain man whose exploits had grown to mythical proportions through years of frontier storytelling. Some said he could track anything that left prints and survive weeks in the wilderness with nothing but his knife and his wits. Others claimed he had once killed a dozen armed men to protect a wagon train full of families. But everyone agreed on one thing: Stone McKenna was not someone you wanted as an enemy, especially if you made your living by preying on those weaker than yourself. As the massive figure drew closer, the boys chained to the fence felt something they hadn't experienced. In weeks, Samuel straightened his shoulders despite his exhaustion, sensing that their situation was about to change dramatically. The younger children stopped whimpering and began to watch the approaching rider with something approaching wonder, as if salvation itself was riding toward them across the desert floor. Stone McKenna had indeed come to the work camp with a specific purpose in mind. Word had reached him in his mountain cabin about the conditions at Briggs' facility, stories of child abuse and exploitation that had awakened the same protective fury that had driven him to intervene in similar situations throughout his life. He had ridden hard for 2 days to reach this place, and what he saw, chained to that fence in the blazing sun, made his jaw tighten with the kind of cold anger that had made him a legend among those who preyed on the innocent. Stone McKenna dismounted from his massive black stallion with fluid grace despite his enormous size, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a sound like thunder that seemed to reverberate through the entire camp. Up close, he was even more intimidating than the stories suggested, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and hands that looked like they could crush stones to powder. His weathered face, scarred by decades of frontier life and marked by every kind of hardship the wilderness could offer, showed no emotion as he studied the scene before him. But his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, burned with an intensity that made even Briggs take an involuntary step backward. "Afternoon," Stone said quietly, his voice deep and gravelly, like distant thunder rolling across mountain peaks. The simple greeting carried more menace than most men could manage with a full threat, and the boys, chained to the fence, felt their hearts leap with hope as they realized their potential savior had finally arrived. "This is private property," Briggs said, trying to inject authority into his voice, despite the fear that was making his hands shake. "You got no business here, mountain man. Best you turn around and ride back where you came from before you find yourself in trouble you can't handle." Stone's pale eyes moved slowly from Briggs to the guards, then to Dr. Warren, and finally to the 7 boys chained to the fence like animals awaiting slaughter. His expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered behind his steady gaze as he took in the full scope of what was happening at this supposedly legitimate correctional facility. "Trouble I can't handle," Stone repeated thoughtfully, as if considering the possibility for the first time in his life. "That's an interesting concept. Been a while since anyone suggested I might not be able to handle something. Can't say I care much for the implication." The mountain man walked slowly toward the fence where the boys were chained, his movements deliberate and controlled, like a predator sizing up potential prey. Each step seemed to increase the tension in the air, and even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "What are you boys in for?" Stone asked gently, kneeling down to Tommy's level and speaking in the kind of voice that fathers used with frightened children. His tone, when addressing the boys, was completely different from the cold menace he had directed at Briggs, warm and reassuring despite his intimidating appearance. "We took bread from a bakery, sir," Samuel answered, his voice stronger now that someone was finally listening to them with compassion instead of cruelty. "We were hungry, and we hadn't eaten in 3 days. We know it was wrong to steal, but the little ones were getting weak from not having food." Stone nodded slowly, his weathered face showing understanding rather than judgment. He had been hungry himself as a child, had known the desperate emptiness that drove people to take risks they would never consider under normal circumstances. The idea of punishing children for the crime of trying to survive made his blood run cold with anger. "And how long have you been chained out here in the sun?" he asked, his voice remaining gentle despite the fury that was building in his chest like a wildfire. "Since dawn, sir," 12-year-old Peter replied. "They chain us here every day after the work detail ends. Say it's to make sure we don't try to run away during the night." 12 hours, Stone said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled rage that made experienced fighters check their weapons and look for escape routes. 12 hours in this heat, without water, after a full day of hard labor. Children, aged 8 to 16, Dr. Warren stepped forward, sensing that the mountain man might be their only hope of preventing a tragedy. Mr. McKenna, she said quietly, I've been trying to get these conditions changed for weeks, but Mr. Briggs claims he has full legal authority over these boys. Legal authority, Stone repeated, rising to his full intimidating height and turning to face Briggs directly. That's what you call torturing children. That's what you call justice. These boys are convicted criminals, Briggs said, but his bluster was beginning to crumble under the weight of Stone's moral authority and obvious physical superiority. They were sentenced by Judge Harrison to 6 months of corrective labor, and I'm carrying out that sentence according to the law. According to whose law? Stone asked, his voice growing colder with each word. I know Judge Harrison's reputation, and I know yours too. This isn't about justice, Briggs. This is about profit. You're using these children as slave labor and calling it rehabilitation. The accusation hit its mark, and Briggs's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by Stone or the guards who were beginning to position themselves for potential violence. You're interfering with official legal proceedings, Briggs snarled, his patience finally reaching its breaking point. I could have you arrested for obstruction of justice. Stone's laugh was cold and humorless. You could try, he said simply. But before you do, you might want to ask yourself if you're prepared for the consequences of that decision. The mountain man's quiet confidence was far more intimidating than any amount of shouting or threatening could have been. There was something about his stillness, his absolute certainty in his own abilities, that made it clear he had faced worse odds than 7-1 and emerged victorious. Boys, Stone said, turning back to the children chained to the fence, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and keep them closed no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me? Samuel nodded, understanding that violence was about to erupt and that the mountain man was trying to protect them from witnessing something that might haunt their dreams for years to come. He helped the younger boys close their eyes and turn away from what was about to happen. Last chance, Briggs, Stone said quietly. Unlock those chains and let these children go, and we can settle this without anyone getting hurt. Go to hell, Briggs replied, his hand finally clearing leather as he drew his gun with the practiced speed of a man who had killed before Dot. But fast as Briggs was, Stone McKenna was faster. The mountain man's massive hand closed around Briggs's. Wrist before the gun could clear its holster, and the sound of bones breaking was audible across the entire camp. The foreman's scream of pain echoed off the surrounding rocks as his weapon fell uselessly to the ground. Dot. The 2 guards tried to rush Stone from either side, but the mountain man was ready for them. His left fist caught the first guard in the solar plexus with enough force to double him over and leave him gasping for breath on the ground. The second guard managed to land a blow to Stone's ribs, but the mountain man absorbed the impact without flinching and responded with an uppercut that lifted the man completely off his feet. Within 30 seconds, all 3 of Briggs's men were unconscious or incapacitated, and Stone stood alone among the fallen, with barely a scratch to show for the encounter. His breathing wasn't even elevated, as if subduing 3 armed men had been nothing more than light exercise. Keys, Stone said simply, extending his massive hand toward the groaning Briggs. The broken foreman fumbled in his pocket with his uninjured hand and produced a ring of keys, his face twisted with pain and defeat. Stone took the keys without a word and began methodically unlocking the chains that held the 7 boys to the fence. You're all free now, Stone said gently as the last shackle fell away. Dr. Warren, these children need immediate medical attention. Can you see to that? Of course, the doctor replied, her voice filled with gratitude and admiration for what the mountain man had accomplished. But what about them? She gestured toward Briggs and his guards. They'll live, Stone said dismissively. which is more than they deserved after what I saw here today. As the boys gathered around their rescuer, their faces showing wonder and gratitude despite their obvious exhaustion, Stone felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of having done something unquestionably right in a world that often seemed filled with darkness and cruelty. Subscribe to our channel now to see how these boys' lives are transformed by one man's courage. Don't miss what happens next in this incredible story of justice and redemption. As Dr. Warren worked to treat the boys' injuries and dehydration, Stone McKenna stood guard over the fallen guards and the whimpering Briggs, his presence alone enough to prevent any thoughts of retaliation or escape. The mountain man's pale eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the surrounding desert for signs of additional threats, while his mind worked on the larger problem of what to do with 7 orphaned boys who had nowhere to go once they left this hellish place. "Mr. McKenna," Samuel said quietly, approaching the towering figure who had become their salvation, "what's going to happen to us now? We don't have anywhere to go, and they'll probably just send us to another camp like this one." Stone looked down at the 16-year-old boy, seeing in his face the same combination of hope and fear that he had once carried himself as a child, abandoned by the world. Samuel was trying to be strong for the younger boys, trying to be the leader they needed, but the weight of responsibility was clearly taking its toll on his young shoulders. "That's not going to happen," Stone said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that made people believe in the possibility of better days ahead. "I've got some ideas about that, but first we need to make sure you're all healthy and safe." Dr. Warren had completed her examination of the boys and was looking at Stone with a mixture of professional concern and personal admiration. "They're all suffering from dehydration and exhaustion," she reported, "but with proper care they should recover fully. However, I'm worried about what will happen when word of this gets back to Judge Harrison and the other officials who profit from this operation." "Let me worry about Judge Harrison," Stone replied grimly. "I've had dealings with corrupt judges before, and they usually find that their authority doesn't extend as far as they thought it did." The mountain man walked over to where Briggs was, sitting propped against a fence post, clutching his broken wrist and trying to stop the bleeding from his nose. The former foreman looked up at Stone with eyes filled with hatred and fear, knowing that his comfortable arrangement had come to a permanent end. "Here's what's going to happen," Stone said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled menace that made smart men listen carefully. "You're going to gather up whatever personal belongings you have and leave this territory. If I ever see you again, if I even hear that you're working with children anywhere in the West, I'll finish what we started here today." "You can't just run me out of town," Briggs protested weakly. "I've got legal contracts, business arrangements. Judge Harrison will have something to say about this." Stone's smile was cold as mountain snow. "Judge Harrison is going to have his hands full explaining why he was sending children to a slave camp. I don't think he's going to have much time to worry about your problems." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Judge Harrison himself appeared on the horizon, riding toward the camp with a small escort of men who looked more like hired guns than legitimate law enforcement officers. Word of the disturbance had apparently reached him quickly, and he was coming to assess the damage to his profitable arrangement. "This could be trouble," Dr. Warren said quietly. "Harrison has connections all the way to the territorial capital. He could make life very difficult for anyone who opposes him." "Could he?" Stone asked mildly, checking the action on his rifle with the casual efficiency of someone who had used weapons to solve problems for most of his adult life. "Well, I suppose we'll find out just how much influence he really has." Judge Harrison and his escort arrived at the camp in a cloud of dust and righteous indignation, clearly expecting to find the situation under control and the troublemaker dealt with appropriately. What they found instead was Briggs and his guards incapacitated, 7 boys free from their chains and receiving medical attention, and Stone McKenna standing over the scene like an avenging angel with a rifle in his hands. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison demanded, his voice shrill with outrage and barely concealed panic. "These boys are convicted criminals serving legally mandated sentences. You have no right to interfere with the administration of justice." "Justice," Stone repeated thoughtfully, as if considering the word for the first time. "That's an interesting choice of words, Judge. Tell me, what kind of justice chains 8-year-old children to fences in the desert sun for 12 hours a day?" "These boys are thieves and vagrants," Harrison replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction, as he found himself facing someone who obviously wasn't impressed by official authority. "The law requires that they be taught the value of honest work and proper discipline." "The law," Stone said, his voice growing colder with each word, "doesn't allow for torture of children, no matter what crimes they might have committed." "What you've got here isn't a correctional facility, Judge. It's a slave camp, and you're profiting from child labor while hiding behind legal mumbo-jumbo." The accusation hung in the desert air like a challenge to battle, and Judge Harrison realized that his carefully constructed criminal enterprise was crumbling before his eyes. His hand moved toward his gun, but the sight of Stone's rifle, held with obvious competence and readiness, made him reconsider the wisdom of escalating the situation to violence. "You're making a serious mistake, Mountain Man," Harrison said, trying to inject authority into his voice, despite the fear that was making his hands shake. "I have connections in the territorial government. I can make your life very difficult if you continue to interfere with legal proceedings." "Connections?" Stone mused as if the concept amused him. "You know, Judge, I've met a lot of men over the years who thought their connections would protect them from the consequences of their actions. Most of them learned different eventually." Dr. Warren stepped forward, sensing that the situation was reaching a critical point where someone might make a decision that couldn't be undone. "Judge Harrison," she said firmly, "I'm prepared to testify that these children were being systematically abused and tortured in violation of every civilized standard of treatment. My medical records will show clear evidence of cruel and unusual impunishment." The threat of official testimony from a licensed physician seemed to deflate Harrison's bluster-like air from a punctured balloon. He realized that his legal authority meant nothing in the face of documented evidence of child abuse, especially when that evidence was being protected by someone with Stone McKenna's reputation for violence. "What do you want?" Harrison asked. Finally, his voice resigned to the inevitability of negotiation rather than confrontation. "I want these boys' sentences vacated," Stone said simply. "I want all charges against them dropped, and I want a written guarantee that they won't face any further legal harassment for their alleged crimes." "And if I refuse?" Stone's smile was cold and predatory. "Then Dr. Warren's testimony about conditions at this camp gets shared with every newspaper in the territory, along with some very interesting questions about where all that money for correctional facilities has been going." The threat of public exposure was more terrifying to Harrison than any amount of physical violence could have been. His entire criminal enterprise depended on maintaining the appearance of legitimate law enforcement, and a scandal involving child abuse would destroy not only his career, but also his freedom. "Fine," Harrison said through gritted teeth. "The charges are dropped. The boys are free to go." "Excellent," Stone replied. "Now, about their immediate future. These boys need homes, not just freedom." "That's not my responsibility," Harrison protested. "Actually, it is," Stone said firmly. "See, you've been collecting money from the territory for their care and rehabilitation. Since you've been pocketing most of that money instead of using it for its intended purpose, I figure you owe them something in the way of compensation." What followed was a negotiation that resulted in Judge Harrison agreeing to provide a substantial sum of money to support the boys until they could find permanent homes or reach adulthood. The amount was enough to ensure that none of them would ever again face the desperate hunger that had driven them to steal bread in the first place. A's. The sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Stone gathered the 7 boys around him to discuss their future. They looked at him with the kind of devotion usually reserved for beloved family members, their young faces glowing with gratitude and newfound hope. "You boys have some choices to make," Stone said gently. "You've got enough money now to live comfortably while you figure out what you want to do with your lives. Some of you might want to find families to take you in. Others might prefer to stick together and make your own way in the world." His 8-year-old voice filled with the kind of trust that only children could offer so completely. "Are you going to stay with us?" Stone knelt down to the boy's level, his weathered face softening with genuine affection. "I've got responsibilities in the mountains," he said quietly, "but I'll make sure you're all settled somewhere safe before I go. And if you ever need help, if anyone ever tries to hurt you again, you send word to Stone McKenna. I'll come running." The group prepared to leave the work camp forever, the boys walking free for the first time in months while their tormentors slunk away in defeat and disgrace. Samuel approached Stone one final time. "Why did you help us?" the 16-year-old asked. "You didn't even know us. Why would you risk so much for strangers?" Stone was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes looking out over the desert landscape where so much pain had been transformed into hope. "Because everyone deserves a chance," he said finally. "Because children shouldn't have to pay for adult failures. And because sometimes, if you're lucky, you get the opportunity to do something that really matters." As they rode away from the camp toward the lights of Silver Creek in the distance, the 7 boys knew that their lives had been changed forever by one man's courage and compassion. They had learned that evil could be defeated, that justice could prevail, and that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. Behind them, the empty work camp stood as a monument to the power of one individual to change the world. One act of courage at a time. Don quote, "To forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of courage, justice, and redemption from the Old West. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of heroes."